this is a big debate at the moment, right? Like, should it be open source, for example, right? So my colleague Jan LeCun, who is head of AI research at Meta, believes that that everything should be open source. And there's certainly something to be said for that, because the whole community gets to participate. It's transparent. Like, we know what the risks are. We can design policy around it. So it has all those advantages. But what scares people is, I guess Kim Jong-il. So you mean like everyone has access to it? That's a shame, right? So that's that's the downside. Is like it gives provides ammunition to everyone, power and the ammunition, and so those are some of the concerns with open source. Yeah, I think there's good reason to go the open source way, but that also brings with it all kinds of other requirements for transparency and use. And so we may end up in a situation where we have open source, but everything is heavily tracked. That ultimately the responsibility has to lie with someone. And those are some of the most sort of open and vexing issues around AI. Right? You saw that there was a Taylor Swift deep fake. Last week that got a lot of attention, but this has been going on for a long time. It's been going on for years. It just hasn't gotten a lot of attention because it wasn't Taylor Swift. But now that it's gotten a lot of attention, and people say, "Oh, it happened to Taylor Swift. It could happen to anyone." Well, it has been happening to lots of people already. These deep fake.
Today's episode is proudly brought to you by Effortless. Effortless is the ultimate solution for startups and SMBs seeking seamless money management and compliance handling, e-invoicing and e-way bill generation with just a couple of clicks, slashing collection efforts by a staggering 90% through the magic of automated follow-ups, snapping a quick photo of your bill to instantly log expenses. With Effortless, you get the power of a consolidated bank account view, seeing both business and personal accounts seamlessly integrated. With Effortless, making UPI-like payments is a breeze. Effortless keeps you on track, ensuring your finances and compliance are always in top shape. Effortless wasn't just created by anyone. It was crafted by chartered accountant turned entrepreneurs who understand the pulse of startups and SMBs. Visit www.goeffortless.ai and embark on a journey that will redefine the way you do business. Effortless, because managing a business should be anything but a hassle.
Hello everybody, welcome to another episode of the ContraMinds podcast. This is a very special episode as we've achieved an important milestone of 50 episodes at ContraMinds. I would like to thank all our fans, our phenomenal guests who believed in us and our story, and of course our sponsors. Today we have Professor Vasant Dhar, who is an artificial intelligence researcher, a data scientist, and the host of the podcast Brave New World. Brave New World explores how technology and virtualization in the post-COVID era is transforming humanity. He is also the professor of the Stern School of Business, New York, and the editor-in-chief of the journal Big Data. I spoke to Professor Vasant Dhar on a range of topics on AI, which included the paradigm shifts AI has gone through over the years, how open should AI be, should we revisit laws with AI becoming mainstream, and the importance of the knowledge of psychology and neuroscience to be a world-class AI professional, among many other ideas. I thoroughly enjoyed this conversation and the answers that Professor Vasant Dhar gave, which were laser-focused and straight from the gut. Over to my conversation with Professor Vasant Dhar. Hello, Professor Vasant Dhar. Thanks a lot. I'm really delighted to have you as a special guest in the ContraMinds podcast. Thanks for accepting my request. Lovely talking to you.
Thank you, Swami. I am delighted to be here.
So let me, first, I just wanted to talk to you about your own journey into how did you get into AI, and how is really the journey from where you started, and what does the Center for Data Science do today?
The journey, as many things in life are, this was pure serendipity. I had no idea what I wanted to do in life. I was like 22, 23 years old. I, was in graduate school in Pittsburgh, and I was in the computing center writing up a little program for one of my professors to implement some decision-making algorithm he'd come up with called the analytic hierarchy process. And this senior PhD student comes to me and says, "Hey, there's this professor who's like expert in artificial intelligence. He's built the world's first medical diagnostic system. I'd like him to offer a doctoral seminar. Can you come along? I need to show some strength in numbers." And I said, like, sure, like, what is AI? And he said, it's about making computers smart. And I said, oh, that sounds great. Let's go. So we did, and we went to the medical school. There was a lab up on the 13th floor, I remember, of the medical center at the University of Pittsburgh. And there was a long room, and in the middle of the room, there was a terminal connected to a computer at Stanford. You're talking, this was like 1979. And so there was no PCs. There was the days of time sharing. And there was a physician puffing a cigar, talking to, quote unquote, talking to this system via his assistant who was typing for him. And he entered some symptoms about a case, and the machine, the program was called Internist. It came back and asked him some more questions. And at one point, during the dialogue, he said, "Why are you asking me this question?" And Internist said, "Because the evidence you've given me so far is consistent with the following hypotheses, and this will help me discriminate between the top two." And I was just blown away by that. It just completely, blew my mind to see a computer behaving in that way. My previous interactions with computers had been, writing Fortran programs to solve, complex differential equations, iteratively, as part of my chemical engineering days in IIT. So this was just like, blew my mind to see a machine having a dialogue with a human like this and discussing a case. And it was clear that it wasn't following some sort of pre-specified logic, but it was actually sensitive to context, and so that's what totally blew me away. And and then we were waiting for the prof to get off the phone. He was in his office, and then we went in, and he was like just so sweet, to us, and said he'd be delighted to offer the course. And he ended up becoming one of my main mentors at graduate school and my thesis advisor. So that's how I sort of landed in AI. It was actually through medical diagnosis, and he introduced me to another pioneer in AI called Herbert Simon, who was actually a Nobel laureate who had won the Nobel Prize for Economics, and he was one of the people who coined the term artificial intelligence. So he introduced me to Simon, and that sort of set me along this path that has, that's what set me going. And then, so when I was graduating, I was looking for a job, and, I walked down Washington Square south along the park for my job interview. And I thought, hey, this would be kind of a cool place to live. And as luck would have it, my talk went well. I really got along with my colleagues, and I ended up in NYU. And so I've been there ever since, except for, a few years on Wall Street in the mid 90s, where I brought machine learning to Wall Street.
Yeah.
And so I've been fortunate to have been, I guess, what some people call a pracademic. I'm an academic. I'm sort of a researcher, but I get to actually try my ideas out and make them work in practice. And in this case, the ideas really had to do with, the fact I was in New York and in the financial industry, and so market prediction seemed to be sort of the obvious thing to try out, given that data was becoming available. And so that's what I got interested in the mid 90s. Okay. Went to Wall Street, took a bunch of my PhD students along, and set up the first machine learning based hedge fund. So I've been very fortunate to have had the opportunities to have to have met great people who set me along a path that I've really enjoyed. I have to say, it's been a lot of fun.
You talk about the the Kun net framework of a whole set of paradigm shifts that AI has gone through, right?
Right,
So,
right.
what are the paradigm shifts that AI has gone through, and what impact has each of these shifts happened for the business and the society at large? So, what are these shifts that you have seen, and can you talk to us about it?
Yeah, that's a great question. And, there's this article I wrote called The Paradigm Shifts in Artificial Intelligence that I posted on Archive last year, which I initially wrote as sort of an initial opening article for a PhD seminar that I was co-teaching, just to give students kind of a grounding about the history of AI and what got us here and why does it matter. And so I start the sort of story of or rather the history of AI, at the end of sort of what I call the game playing era. In the 60s, there was a lot of experimentation with sort of game playing algorithms for searching graphs, which sort of came out of the areas of sort of optimization and search. But in the 70s, I'd say there was a whole new, era of what I call expert systems that got going, where people felt that for specific domains like medicine, which is the poster child for AI, and engineering and, problems with a certain amount of structure in it, you should be able to talk to human experts and extract their expertise in a way that was representable in a machine that could then be used for reasoning about, that domain. So medical diagnosis, being a prime example where the system that I referred to, Internist, had been built, over 10 years of interaction between, computer scientists and specialists, diagnosticians in medicine. And the knowledge had been extracted case by case, carefully assembled, represented, in the forms of hierarchies, rules, causal relationships, all of that kind of stuff. The knowledge was extracted and declared, and then there was a way to sort of use it, in the context of a new case. And that's what I was observing. My first interaction with AI was this expert systems paradigm and expert physician discussing a case with Internist. And I'll come full circle to this, by the way. So that was the expert systems era, but it was, very hard to extract knowledge reliably from experts and to represent things like uncertainty, right? Because at that time, people were thinking about knowledge in terms of rules, but then how do you attach uncertainty and context and all that? So it becomes really difficult to do that in a top-down way. And the machine learning era sort of started emerging in the 80s and 90s, where people were saying, hey, why, sort of like trying to specify these rules, why can't we learn them from the data? Let's just look at lots of cases about medical diagnosis, and from those abstract out, the knowledge which can then be applied, right? So that was sort of the next era of machine learning, where you could take data, you could, do what was called feature engineering, curate it properly, and then use a machine learning algorithm to extract patterns from data, to say that if I see someone has pallor, then maybe they have excess bilirubin. And so maybe there's something causing that elevated level of bilirubin in the blood, right? So that was the context. So now you could actually derive those rules instead of having an expert specify them. But it was still really cumbersome to do feature engineering, right? So if you had to, let's say, use an X-ray image or an MRI as part of diagnosis, the physician had to translate that into a vocabulary and say that to the machine, right? So that wasn't great. And so what the sort of new sort of deep learning paradigm did was that it solved perception, right? That now computers could actually see the world and listen to it and read about it, in the way that humans do, and so they could ingest the input directly from the environment. So that was a big deal, was solving perception. Right?
Yeah.
So intelligence sort of went more upstream.
Okay.
And And then the latest paradigm shift, which I call, the shift to general intelligence, is this emergence of these pre-trained models like large language models that
Yeah.
are just pre-trained with, lots of knowledge that is available on the internet. But they're not pre-trained with any specific purpose necessarily, other than predict the next word. But it turns out that they learn a lot about the world just by doing, prediction of the next word. And they're usable for all kinds of things, like general question answering systems, writing code, and all that kind of stuff, right? Now, I'll end by saying this. I took some of the dialogues that I had, from internist days, and I tried working with ChatGPT. I fed ChatGPT the exact same symptoms about a case. And I said, what's going on in this case? Right? And ChatGPT actually was amazing, right? Because it's very conversational. It said, oh, yeah, I see what's going on here. Maybe there's blah, blah, blah. And then it just stops, and that's it, and then I'm like, but tell me more. And it's like, well, what do you mean? And so then I have to sort of feed it another symptom, like, which internist had sort of asked for, right? Like, oh, was there a pain in the lower left quadrant, right? So then I'm telling ChatGPT, by the way, there was no pain in the, after the patient had a big meal. And so ChatGPT says, oh, okay, that's good evidence. In that case, and then it chugs along a little bit more and gives me all kinds of stuff. But it hasn't gotten to the point where it gives me the kind of dialogue that I could have with internists, 50 years ago. So we've come a long way, from the days of specifying knowledge to the machine just learning everything on its own, which is where we are now. But we still have a very long ways to go in terms of like, reaching, human levels of intelligence. But I think we will get there, and I think the machine will even surpass us, in the future.
Brilliant. I think your way of summarizing the four eras was just quite amazing and very, very, I would say very vivid is what I would call it. I had one question around this debate around, the connectionist models, right? And how these connectionist models, there's a lot of debate around saying, hey, neural networks initially, during the Minsky era was, they stopped working, saying, hey, neural networks can't do reasoning too much. And now when you look at how it has accelerated the AI, development and the kind of stuff that has got done, do you believe, do you believe there's a lot of, what I would call as, reasons to believe that the connectionist models are the most important when you want to drive this momentum towards what you call as artificial general intelligence?
I think that it will certainly be a major part of the future of AI going forward, for a number of reasons. One is that we've sort of looked inside the brain, and we find that it's actually a neural network, right? So there's good reason to believe that this biological architecture that's motivated the artificial neural net architecture is a reasonable one for many kinds of, for capturing many types of intelligence,
Yeah.
and especially when it comes to perception, but even cognition, right? But when it comes to perception, this architecture seems to have some pretty major advantages, right, in being able to do object recognition, language understanding, and so on. So it'll certainly be a big part of, AI going forward. Whether it accomplishes everything really remains to be seen, right? Because while we made huge advances in perception and, all kinds of sort of general intelligence kinds of capabilities, we've also regressed in some ways, because these models are so complex that it's very hard to look inside them and see what's really going on. So relative to sort of the earliest paradigm, the expert system one, where everything was explicit and you could see why the machine was doing what it was doing, it's become impossibly difficult to do that now with these large sort of complex models. And so that's, not surprisingly, that's where a lot of action is, to get some more transparency into like what's really going on under the hood. How do they represent knowledge?
Yeah.
What do they really know? What do they really understand? So in a nutshell, I'd say, yeah, it's going to be an important part of AI going forward, but I'm not sure it'll solve everything that
Okay.
we need to solve in order to get to, human level intelligence and then super intelligence beyond that.
Okay. So, which gives me the next question. I think you kind of got me into the next question that I wanted to ask. How open should be, how open should AI be?
This is a big debate at the moment, right? Like, should it be open source, for
Yeah.
example, right? So my colleague Jan LeCun, who is head of AI research at Meta, believes that that everything should be open source. And there's certainly something to be said for that, because the whole community gets to participate. It's transparent. Like, we know what the risks are. We can design policy around it. So it has all those advantages. But what scares people is, I guess Kim Jong Il. So you mean like everyone has access to it?
Yeah.
That's a shame, right? So that's the downside. Is like it gives provides ammunition to everyone, the
Mm.
power and the ammunition, and so those are some of the concerns with open source. But if you were to ask me, what my position would be, I'd say, yeah, I think there's good reason to go the open source way, but that also brings with it all kinds of other requirements for transparency and use. And so we may end up in a situation where we have open source, but everything is heavily tracked. That ultimately the responsibility has to lie with someone. And those are some of the most sort of open and vexing issues around AI. Right? You saw that there was a Taylor Swift deep fake.
Yeah.
Last week that got a lot of attention, but this has been going on for a long time. It's been going
Correct.
on for
Correct.
years. It just
Correct.
hasn't gotten a lot of attention because it wasn't Taylor Swift.
Correct.
But now that it's gotten a lot of attention, and people say, "Oh, it happened to Taylor Swift. It could happen to anyone." Well,
Yeah.
it has been happening to lots of people already.
Mm.
These deep fakes and people producing pornographic films using
Correct.
the likeness of people, and the trouble is that there aren't even enough laws at the moment that
Yeah.
that say that a crime has been committed, let alone who's liable and how to address it.
Yeah. So I think you talk about that a lot, which is about the risks that these algorithms really provide, and therefore how do you mitigate them? So there are no written laws today. So how do you think this would evolve? Because I think the way I see it is this has not been done in the past, right? Like what you write about in one of your blogs, you talk about how electricity changed manufacturing, internet changed knowledge work, right? And
Right.
now AI is changing a whole host of professions, a whole host of industries, and that is going to really need a whole set of rules. That's, I think, something that you talk about in terms of transparency, in terms of risk mitigation. How does one start? And in your opinion, is there some kind of a set of frameworks that people need to look at?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I've written about the fact that this issue tends to be one that is being addressed differently in different parts of the world. Right? In the US, not surprisingly, the culture is, let a thousand flowers bloom, and we'll deal with these problems, as and when they arise, right? Let the market decide what's best, and let's not interfere, right? So that's like on the one extreme. On the other extreme, you have China, which is observing everything. They own all the data. They have the right to do anything
Yeah,
with it, right? So that's like a totalitarian or rather an authoritarian kind of a model.
yeah,
And then you have Europe, which is sort of concerned about risks of data misuse, with the whole GDPR regulation coming in, um, and those kinds of concerns. And then India's got sort of another interesting kind of model, with the emergence of, biometric identification. And now traveling in India has become, electronics are everywhere, right? It's
yeah,
just right? And in the sense, it's become easy, right? That
Yeah, correct.
you can, right, you can use these IDs, and a lot of things become easier. So it makes life easier in many ways for lots of people, like having an identifier where you can authenticate yourself, which, by the way, doesn't exist in most other parts of the world.
Mm,
Strangely enough, right? I mean, in the US, you can't actually
mm,
prove who you are,
yeah,
just through an identity like you can in India.
yeah,
Um, but there are concerns in India that the institutions maybe are not strong enough to resist government overreach of data and things like that. So there are those kinds of concerns in India around privacy and misuse of these
absolutely.
kinds of systems. So there isn't any one answer. It's almost like it's being dealt at in different parts of the world differently.
Yeah,
Um, and yeah, and I guess it'll just continue to
evolve.
evolve, or I was going to say stumble along like that, right? You get things that mishaps that happen, things don't work.
Yeah,
In the US, we'll see lawsuits. We're already seeing that
yeah,
around Section 230 and platform liability. But we'll probably see more of those as the technology comes along, right? So the US sort of deals with it on a ongoing basis, with very light touch.
yeah.
Yeah, remains to be seen how other parts of the world will deal with it.
But don't you think, Professor, that when you look at the big tech firms today, the fact that they were allowed to blossom, and now they have become so large and almost monopolistic, right? In terms of size, in terms of the data that they hold, and therefore there's a bit of worry that hey, these 4 or 5 big tech firms typically control all data, and they have been allowed to sprout. They've become so large today to entangle and get them out, untangle them is also getting difficult.
It is indeed. I mean, once these platforms get established and dominant,
Yeah,
it becomes very difficult to displace them. I mean, that's one of the lessons that we've learned from the internet is, when these platforms become large, it's almost like a winner take all outcome.
yeah,
So and that's what we see here. So you're right, but at the same time, I think society has become more aware
yeah,
of you know this imbalance of power, and so I would expect to see possibly even people working with the government to control um, the private sector. I mean that
yeah, yeah, yeah.
so the government and the people might become allies
Hmm.
in
Perfect, perfect.
in resisting this,
Yeah,
I guess,
great.
what I'd call data hegemony.
Yeah, absolutely. The other thing that I wanted to delve into was this one article that you had written about uh, how conversational AI versus search, right? This whole hockey stick growth that,
Right.
how search is getting disrupted with conversational AI. Do
Right.
you believe in the next decade or so, search will completely get transformed with conversational AI? And how would the world look like with conversational AI dominating? In fact, you've written there saying it's almost giving sleepless nights to Google that Microsoft has got there, right? So therefore,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah. So this was something I wrote about, in, I guess it's just a little more than a year ago,
yeah,
after the emergence of ChatGPT, where I said that I point to the fact that sometimes technologies get disrupted, right, and that search had been improving steadily,
mm,
slowly and steadily over a long period of time, and Google was the dominant player in search. Bing was like a distant number two, right? So, um, and what happens in markets like that, and so search is sort of becoming mature, but there's a framework called the innovator's dilemma by
mm,
Clay Christensen, right, which describes
correct.
this really well, which is that incumbents get comfortable, right? That
Yeah,
and that they're catering to a market, and they forget to see a threat
Yeah.
that is emerging that might be a lot inferior, but it appeals to some people, and then it suddenly starts appealing to the entire market.
Yeah.
And that's the way conversational AI sort of emerged. It emerged as a tool, right? It got people's attention, and it captured people's imagination, and suddenly that was the buzzword. And so why do you really need search?
Yeah.
Boring plain search when you've got conversational AI. So yeah, I mean, and the ironic thing is that the architecture, this whole transformer architecture that underlies large language models was,
Yeah.
developed at Google. But Google was like too slow to actually capitalize on it, whereas OpenAI, being this, much more, much smaller, company with no liability, was able to sort of release it into the wild and actually have people play with it. And it was brilliant for Microsoft to have taken a large stake in this, because Microsoft couldn't have done this
Yeah.
by themselves, right? I mean, their previous attempt at a chatbot was a disaster.
Yeah.
They're not that kind of company. Whereas, through OpenAI, they could do it, without incurring any kind of risk. But to come back and sort of answer your question and bring it full circle, yeah, I think going forward, we'll probably see traditional search more or less disappear and be replaced by, a much better intelligence in the form of sort of conversational AI.
Okay. So, which means that the business models around how conversational AI will then get monetized, unlike how search is monetized today, which is largely through ad networks, right?
Yeah.
And therefore, there'll be a whole new model that one needs to think, which could be a subscription model, like the way OpenAI AI Pro has got, which is really you need to subscribe to some some services around there. Would there be new business models if you were to look at
Yeah.
it? Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, and you can already see this, right? I mean, OpenAI is essentially like a freemium model, right? They make 3.5 available for free. If you want ChatGPT 4, you got to pay $20 a month.
Yeah.
And then if you want more, but you're limited still, right? You can't have like a huge transcript you can put into GPT-4. It complains. And so if you need to do something more sophisticated, for example, I wanted to get GPT to take my podcast with Aswat Damodaran and summarize it and give me the key 5 points, right? And so I, basically had to get OpenAI's program called Whisper to take my MP3 file, translate that into a text file, and then, use an API to say, okay, whatever text comes, summarize the 5 key points, right? And it cost me, 22 cents for the transcription to text and 23 cents for that API call to actually give me the 5 points, which the free version could have given me, but not for the entire transcript, right? So we're already seeing this emerging. So I think there's a lot of money to be made here, both at the retail and business level.
So therefore, if you do a blue sky thinking around how businesses can take advantage of something like this, you had written about this in your real estate example. I saw in one of your newsletters how you applied it in the real estate world. How do you think businesses can take advantage? If I was an automotive company or if I were a retail company, and I have, because there's a lot of discussion around AI, but if I were a retail company, how do I take advantage of this?
And that's a great question. And the answer goes back to sort of what I was saying earlier, which is that, deep learning solved perception, right? A lot of human work involves perception, right? It involves looking at something. It involves reading something, right? It involves listening to something, to people, right? So a lot of the input that humans get is perceptual. And, traditionally that had to be transformed into something for the machine to process. Now imagine, instead of, and the real estate example you refer to, you don't need to have like an inspector to send to a house to look at its condition and take pictures and stuff like that, right? So in the example I mentioned, I just use Google Street View images to predict the condition of a house, right? So I got a bunch of humans to say, hey, what's the condition of this house? Got Google Street View to look at it. And the results were, pretty much very similar to human results, right? So if you can actually eliminate a lot of that grunt work, the very inefficient work, right? Someone has to go to a place, take pictures, and then translate those into language and put it into a report, right? There's a lot of human work, a lot of inefficiency involved in that, right? And you're paying people hundreds of thousands of dollars to do that, right?
Correct.
And now you can do that with a machine that says, hey, take these, send a drone over there, take a bunch of pictures. You can even send a drone inside a house to take pictures, right? You can, process unstructured data. So a lot of this sort of general intelligence becomes available at really low cost, right? And this is what I find like incredibly exciting about what's coming down the road is that a lot of the sort of grunt work that humans do can really get streamlined and done equally well or even better by the machine. So it has huge potential both at the retail level, just you and me using the machine, or businesses, trying to make processes more efficient or better through AI.
So it's almost like saying that so the internet typically got the supply chain optimization, out of the way, and now you're talking about the grunt work, which is really the effort and information processing. Becoming far more efficient, and therefore there's a whole new information supply chain that might get optimized because of AI.
Exactly. Yeah. You put it better than I did, Swami.
So clearly, if I were a retail CEO or an automotive CEO, or if I were running a large enterprise, say a bank, if I were to look at where do I start? What would you suggest? Saying, okay, what kind of experiments should I be doing? Because there's a lot of talk around saying, oh, here is Gen AI, you start here, you start here. So is there a way in which I could, say that, hey, here is a roadmap that you need to try with all these, LLMs?
So I don't think there's a roadmap. That would be nice to actually have a roadmap, right? To go into a business CEO and say, hey, here's the roadmap for you for AI. Go do it. That doesn't exist. In fact, I see a lot of confusion and concern in among senior management. Like, we need to do something, but what do we do, right? So there's a lot of FOMO, right? We need to be doing something, because if we don't do anything, bad things will happen. Right?
Or my board is asking me some questions, so I have to answer them. So let me put up some couple of slides and take it up there, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and this is sort of, I think, where sort of senior management's creativity and imagination, really comes into the picture. I mean, to me, this is what I think leadership in the age of AI is really all about, like figuring this thing out, because there is no roadmap, right? No one's going to tell you what to do. I mean, I had this great conversation with Piyush Gupta, who's the CEO of DBS Bank,
correct.
last year about, what are you thinking about with AI? And he mentioned a couple of examples, like use cases, where he said, like, we'd like to be able to predict when someone is likely to leave, right? Because talent retention is a big part of, effective management, right? Because when talent leaves the door, that can be debilitating, especially like really important, people who are important to the business. So we'd like to be able to retain talent, and so use AI to actually tell us when someone's at risk, which I thought was an interesting application. And then I asked him another question, which is, how about like using AI to actually capture the knowledge of people who may leave? So you can say, Swami was like an amazing Python programmer, right? I mean, he just killed it with all those implementations, but now he's gone and he's working for Citibank. How do we get virtual Swami to write some code for us in his style? I mean, imagine something like that, right? Where you actually have the ability to now retain knowledge in the organization, right? That previously would just sort of bleed out, right? To me, this seems like a huge opportunity, right? To sort of retain knowledge and just be effective, and just literally become a learning organization, right? It's like you just learn and retain and can reuse information over time. So lots of possibilities for how to, to leverage AI, but no roadmap, but lots of interesting ideas.
So, which means that, like what you said, should therefore, as a leader, me as a leader, I should be doing a lot of experiments with AI, and the ability to creatively come up with use cases is really what the leader's role in the age of AI is going to be. Is that how you would define it?
Yeah, it really is, because one of the, I think one of the, just sort of, building on this DBS Bank case, I think one of the things that they did early on was things like, let's really sort of get a better sense of how well our apps are working. Like how happy are people, but without them having to tell us this, right? So let's just sort of maintain touch points. And if we find that people aren't happy, we can actually step in and improve the experience, right? So, being sort of more connected or using data to be more connected and more intelligent about the way you interact with your customers, right? So that was, so those are the initiatives they took, like, I guess 10-ish years ago, like 5 to 10 years ago, that have really worked out for them. And now the question is like, what's the next level? What's the next frontier?
Yeah. Okay. The which brings me to a very important point that you talk about, and which is AI with decision making with AI. The real challenge of taking decisions with AI is we still have to get about the nuanced introspection that humans go through, or the fact that there's a bit of transparency, and there's a depth of consciousness that you talk about, right? Which is really something that as humans we go through. So that kind of data never gets captured in an organization, and everything is around how the data is captured in a structured form in some systems, but not in the way probably the way internet captured it, and therefore you were able to build models. So if I were an organization, would you think the way I should be looking at AI is how do I capture the context, as you call it? Because context capturing requires a new data model, right?
Yeah. So, I mean, this is a very interesting question about AI for decision making. So
Yeah.
let me use a slightly different example, right? And I actually, was at a company recently where this came up, where I was talking to some of the managers about how are you thinking about using AI and generative AI in your business. And, this gentleman happened to mention, we're trying to address our pain points. And I said, well, what are those pain points? And he said, well, for example, reviewing a complex 1,000-page legal contract. That's complicated. It takes a human a long time. And I thought that was a really interesting example of interesting use case of AI, because the question really is the following, which is, if you get an AI to process that really complex legal contract, are you willing to trust it? Right? Are you willing to trust its decisions about that it's okay or not? The not is probably a little bit easier because it'll flag it for you and you can tell whether you agree with it or not. But what about all those things where it said it was okay and it didn't even flag them for you?
Yeah.
Would you trust it completely? And at the moment we don't, right? Because we just have this sort of lingering feeling that it might have missed it. It might have missed some important clause. And so we'd have a human go through the thing again anyway, right? And then, so the question is like, so what did I gain by using the AI if a human had to go through it anyway?
Yeah.
Well, maybe I gained something in efficiency. I don't know. Maybe I gained something in terms of accuracy. I don't know. But that's the problem right now, is we just don't know, because there haven't been enough evaluations done of the technology, like in use in the wild, right? So at the moment, there's a lot of excitement with, hey, look what I can do. Look, man, no hands. I can do this. I can do this. I can do this. Yeah, you can do that. But is it going to make things better? And how? right? And those are the biggest sort of unanswered questions. Now, it's easy for me to say this, but it's very difficult in practice for organizations to do it because, businesses are not in the business of doing science. They're in the business of making money.
Yeah.
Right? And so there's only so much scientific experimentation they can do,
True.
or A/B tests, right? So they have to pick these tests very carefully, right? Because they involve cost.
Yeah.
Right? So evaluating AI is not a costless exercise, but it's necessary in order to be able to understand where you can use it.
So which brings me
So I guess to sort of bring it full circle, I'd say ideally we want AI to be such that we just use it without regard to its mistakes, right? That we know it'll make mistakes, but we say that's still okay, right?
Yeah.
Just like we do with humans, right? We use humans
Exactly.
knowing that humans will make mistakes, but we say that's okay, right?
Yeah.
You will make mistakes, right? So that's the equivalent scenario we need in AI is we have a machine, you have a human. You know what? We're better off with using the machine even with the mistakes it makes.
Yeah.
That's the ideal scenario.
So it's almost like a world where there's a human AI collaboration, right? That's really how the world would change slowly, where I have my assistant, some directions are being given by my AI assistant. I then take those decisions, but then I apply my context on top of whatever knowledge that I have. And therefore, this whole ability to work with AI and humans and collaborate intuitively is something that we need to get ready for.
Exactly. And it'll probably happen in phases where, let's say you tell the machine, hey, generate me a marketing plan for this new client. Here are the specifics of the client, use prior engagement information and generate me a business plan or a proposal, right? And the machine will do it for you, but you as the specialist now still need to go and tweak it and look at it and everything, right? That's fine. Now imagine when you get to a point where you don't even need to do that, right? That it gets so good that you just trust it, right? Or you've got to do very little work, right? And then you get to the point where it just is so good that you just trust it anyway. So we'll probably see that trajectory of adoption. It's what I call sort of the automation frontier, where things go from being purely manual to being mostly automated, but you still need the human in the loop, and then it becomes so good that it makes fewer mistakes and they tend to be not that serious. So you say, well, let the machine just do everything.
Which really brings me, Professor Vasant Dhar, a question where when we move from an industrialization era, okay, to the internet era, to now maybe the AI era as we call it, the industrialization era almost made humans into machines, right? Here is a blueprint, just get me this work done, and we produce mass products and we then ship it out. And now, and before the industrialized era, there were craftsmen who knew their craft. Now, when you come back to the AI era, when I need an AI human collaboration, the craftsmanship has to come back, because I basically have a machine helping me, but I need to know my skill has to be extremely good. I must be an expert. I need to know what to prompt that machine, which means that my skill and knowledge and competency is becoming more and more important vis-a-vis what it was in the industrial era or the internet era. Would you agree with me on that?
So you raise a really interesting question, right? And I wrote this article called "The Day I Chased My Dog," where I had an incident where I gashed my knee because of some accident. I had to go to the emergency room. And I talk about how at the moment we have the worst of both humans and machines. You talked about the fact that the industrial era made robots out of humans, right?
Yeah.
Humans started doing repetitive work. Ironically, it's not that much different now in healthcare. The way I felt like I'd been through an assembly line, that 6 people saw me, they treated me like an object, they asked me a bunch of standard questions, many of them were repetitive, and then by the end of it, by the time I'd seen the 6th person, I finally saw the specialist, the doctor, but by that time I was so overwhelmed with information and choices and decisions that I wasn't even in a mood to ask questions. Right? So, in a sense, I got the worst of both worlds, right? And then, they put staples in my knee, and then 10 days later, I went and got those removed, and the wound opened up. It was a colossal mess. And I wrote about the fact that, gee, wouldn't it have been nice to have a machine actually look at my knee and say, you know what, like, you should wait a few more days. It looks a little risky to open it up, and take these staples out. It might actually open up, right? But the human didn't do that. He just sort of followed a procedure and took the things out, and it opened up, right? So at the moment, we're sort of in this phase where we're getting the worst of both.
Yeah.
When it comes to healthcare, right? We're getting humans behaving like robots, not like the old days where someone really cared about you. When I was a kid, I went to the doctor, I went to the same doctor, they cared about you, right? And now the care has really gone out of the healthcare system. You're seeing strangers all the time who are looking at you sort of atomically as a little part of a larger process.
Yeah.
And there isn't this sort of intelligence of the process that's coming into the picture and saying, hey, I think this is what we need to do to offer, Swami the best possible, treatment for his injury.
Yeah.
But, I'm an optimist. I think we'll get there, but we're just not there yet, because what we've done is we've sort of made the process mechanistic, atomic, impersonal, and it needs to be just the opposite, where we get the best of both worlds. But we're far from that yet. But that I see as the biggest challenge going forward.
True. So which means that if I were a youngster listening to this podcast, and I have another 30, 40 years of career ahead of me, how do I up my thinking skills to be prepared for this AI era?
Oh, that's a great question. I was talking to my students the other day, right? And they're like, I don't know, this is undergraduates, like they're between 18 and 23. And, my graduate students are in the late 20s to early 30s. And my, observation is that, you guys have your lives ahead of you. And this is such an exciting time, to be in this space. Like, I've created 3 sort of AI startups in my career, but I did it during a time when people were resistant to AI. I did it anyway. I brought AI, machine learning to Wall Street, and people said, what the hell is this? Like what? Like, what sense does it make? So, but I did it anyway because I believed that there was a lot of merit to it and it was the future. Whereas now the world is so receptive to it, right? So there are so many possibilities, in terms of creating better data sets to do something, because there's often value in creating data that can be used to do something useful, right? And you talked about big tech as having data, but the world is wide open in terms of the kind of data sets you can collect to do useful things. So what I tell people is, up your thinking in terms of where you think AI, for example, is going to transform an industry or the way people do things, and then start collecting the data to make that possible.
So which means that I've been trained as a student over years thinking mechanically, right? Suddenly when I come to the AI era, or when I start to work and I'm collaborating with machines, I'm collaborating with data, you really talk about, in most of your articles, the fact that contextualization of that data becomes very, very important. And then suddenly my critical thinking skills, my soft skills, my ability to understand the feeling and the nuances of introspection becomes very important. And therefore, if I were a youngster, I would say, hey, working in ambiguity, but clearly ability to, up my thinking skills in how I need to apply this becomes very important, which you are not taught in many educational institutions today.
Indeed. I sort of look at this abstractly as the ability to conduct inquiry, right? That's what it really boils down to is, can you formulate an interesting question and then answer it, right? And there are so many interesting questions out there, that one could think about. I don't know, if I were to just dream, I'd say, what about assistants that for mental health or something, right? Where they're actually able to, increase your brain function and make you feel better and, be more effective, right? Can you actually design machines that make humans better at what they do, or they make people happier, right? Right. So how would you even ask such a question? How would you gather the data to be able to answer it, to show that, oh yeah, under these conditions, actually this kind of a machine does make people better or happier or whatever, right? So
Yeah.
it becomes a question that is an interesting one, because the implications are incredibly important. And
Yeah.
then can you then do you have the chops to be able to answer that question? Right? In
Yeah.
the old days, you required a PhD to do this kind of thing, right? This was like PhD material, but now it's like it's almost like everyone needs the ability to do inquiry, which means ask great questions, and then to be able to work with data to be able to answer them, right? And so this is also one of my themes, is that what AI will force humans to do is make us better, right? So it'll either sort of eliminate us, but those of us that it doesn't eliminate, it'll force us to be better at what we do, right? Which has been the trend of technology anyway. Like a few hundred years ago, you were a genius if you knew how to do arithmetic, right? You were special, but now you're not, right? So technology keeps upping the game, and AI will continue to do that.
So, which brings me to a very important question, Professor, where if I were to look at AI as a career, wherever, and whatever articles I'm reading, you need to have good knowledge of computer science, psychology, and neuroscience, right? Is that the combination that probably the best AI solutions will be built around, and therefore I need to get prepared for those kinds of skills?
You certainly do. I mean, I think those are good skills to have, but I'd go even broader than that, right? I think that EQ is as important, right? It isn't just about the hard skills; it's also about understanding emotions and emotional IQ and quotient. So it's a broad kind of problem. But it's interesting that you're asking me the question of, like, if I want to do a career in AI, right? Because I'm asking myself, like, what does that even mean? I mean, like 10 years, 20 years, 30 years ago, it actually meant something, right? That you were exploring a bunch of methods, and that you were at the forefront of, innovation in terms of methods for, like, let's say, representing and using knowledge. But what does it mean going forward? Like, and the answer is, like, I don't know. It's like asking, when electricity came out, I want to study electricity. I want to be a specialist in electricity. Well, yeah, that's a good idea, but what does that mean, right? Does that mean you're, designing motors and dynamos and washing machines and televisions, right? The things that use electricity
True.
is what you're really getting into. And that's sort of the way I'll use it, the way I look at AI now, that, that some people will continue to innovate and do research in AI itself, right? That's sort of a core research community, but there's just this large ecosystem around it in terms of its applications that's wide open also as a career to people who can then sort of build on AI to do whatever else they want to do.
True, so true. And I kind of reflect on the point that you said a bit earlier. When I look at customer service, how do I look customer service in a machine era and customer service in an AI era, right?
Right.
The customer service in the internet era was all about, I have CRM systems, I have data, I'll have automated emails. I assume that there is a journey, but humans don't follow a pattern around journeys. AI needs to, then the way you think of customer service has to be very, very different with your AI models, with the context, with how my emotions are. And therefore, if I were a bank, I need to look at how this data gets first generated, or how do I interpret the data that's not there, yet use small data sets to interpret what is going on for better customer service. So the way you need to think around this problem is very different from the way you probably were thinking even 5 years back.
Exactly. I mean, and if you think about this abstractly, it's this trend towards like incredible personalization, right? That's what intelligence really gives you, right? You went from sort of standard processes, show up at bank hours between 10 and 3, and take your token and shut up and wait for your service, right? To CRMs where now you get an email, right? But
Yeah,
that's still mechanical, right?
yeah,
To the point where the machine really sort of cares about you and says, "Hey, Swami, like where have you been?
yeah.
The last, are you all right? You normally come on every, but right. So it becomes personal and sort of really one-on-one because it has the data and the intelligence to be able to do that. So yeah, absolutely, that's kind of the brave new world that we're heading towards.
Thanks. So I'm going to end this conversation with a couple of quick fire questions to you. So the first question that I have for you is, what does success mean to you?
Being happy, like spending my time doing exactly what I like to do.
Okay. Uh, that's a brilliant question, brilliant answer for this question around what is success. If you were to invite a couple of people for a dream dinner, who would be the people that you would invite and why?
Oh wow, that is like that's so hard, Swami, because I don't know. I mean, there are literally a few hundred people I
Mhm.
would invite of all ilks, right,
Okay.
ranging from hardcore scientists. For example, I just had a podcast with Peter Ward, who's a paleontologist, who's written about life on Earth. Just something just mind-boggling
Mm.
in terms of the history of life, or I've talked to people about free will. Does free will exist?
Mm.
uh, you know i I don't know. There's a whole bunch of scientists, there's a whole bunch of wackos.
Mm.
I mean, I'd love to have Elon Musk, and like just like, yeah, just crazy intelligent, smart, wacky people like that. I'd love to have
So
you know
you pretty much will have a large party than a dinner.
Exactly. It would be a large party because I'm I guess I'm greedy, right? I want
Yeah.
to call academics, politicians, economists, policymakers, innovators. I'd call a few of each category. Whoever is alive and healthy and kicking.
Uh,
So yeah, sorry, there wasn't a simple answer to that one. Sorry about that.
I think it was an honest and a brilliant answer. To be very very honest, that's really what I got. If you
Thank
were
you.
to recommend a couple of books that you would want anybody to read, what are the things that couple of books that you were inspired by?
There's too much of a recency bias when you ask me about books, right? Because I've like forgotten about
Mm.
the old books,
Mm.
like Brave New World, which I
Yeah.
read in college,
Yeah.
right? Which is I would definitely recommend,
Okay.
Brave New World. Going way back, Death of a Salesman. I
Okay.
loved Arthur Miller.
Yeah.
So I loved that kind of literature. I don't know, like a lot of American literature I grew up with.
Mm.
Um, More recently, I read Gandhi's My Experiments with Truth that I thought was fascinating. I hadn't read that book, surprisingly. I'm an Indian. I should have read it. I've read so much about Gandhi, but I hadn't read that. So I thought that was really cool. And I, was sort of seeing the connection to truth in AI. Um, yeah, I mean, I could go on.
Perfect, perfect. And if there's one great piece of advice that you got, and I'm sure you would have got a lot, what is the one piece of advice that you got which you remember even today?
Um, it's funny you asked that because I said I'd spent several years on Wall Street, and I was thinking of not coming back to academia and just sort of switching careers. And I was having dinner with a colleague of mine who's now passed away, um, and I said, it's just so hard to ignore the fact that I'd be making like 20 times what I make as a lowly professor. And he asked me, he says, "Do you have enough?" And I said, "Yeah, I got enough." And he says, "Well, then do what you like, do what's fun."
Mm.
So I'll never forget that. It was a simple question: "Do you have enough?" And I was like, "Yep, I have enough." And this has come up in sort of some of my earlier podcast conversations I had with John Sexton, where I said, what advice do you give people? And he said, if you keep your needs low, you can do whatever you should pursue whatever it is, just keep your needs modest. And so that was good advice. Keep your needs modest.
In fact, I read that in your newsletter. So that was
and I might just put another one in by Michael Roth, who's the president of Wesleyan. Like, I asked him, I said, what's the purpose of higher education? And he said, it's to maximize serendipitous encounters.
Beautiful.
Which I thought was great, right? The role of education, of higher education, is to maximize the probability of serendipitous encounters. So put yourself out and be open to serendipity. There's another quote that goes something like, luck favors the prepared, right? So, and I think serendipity favors the people who are sort of receptive to it. So
beautiful.
Those are a couple of interesting quotes and pieces of advice that I've heard that really resonated.
Beautiful, beautiful. And what's one thing that you believe that others don't agree with you?
Oh, something that I believe that others don't agree with me. The only thing, I can think of something, but it's too embarrassing because it's become socially unacceptable to talk about this.
Sure.
Yeah, it has to do with why there are fewer swimmers in certain racial groups than others, right? So my answer to that is, I find some people find it, they don't agree with me. But I think that's because they find it socially unacceptable. But I won't get into the details because that'll really get me into trouble.
Yeah, sure. So thanks, Professor Vasant Dhar. It was lovely talking to you, and it was a fun conversation. Really, the time was brilliant in terms of the perspective that you gave. Some of the examples were thoroughly brilliant, and thanks for your time. Thanks for sharing your thoughts on the Contra Minds podcast.
I am delighted to have been here, Swami. I'll just end by noting something, which is that some of my colleagues make fun of me because I believe that names are very important. So certain names are really important. Some names are strong, some names are weak, it's, whatever. But I think Swami is a brilliant name, so I am so envious.
Thanks a lot.
Because I can imagine people saying, so Swami, what do you think? But it's been a pleasure. I really enjoyed it, and thanks for all those questions and follow-ups.
Thanks a lot.